Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the coldest, strangest, and most unintentionally hilarious survival tricks in medieval history. So before you get comfortable, take a moment like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Medieval winter wasn't a season. It was a yearly boss fight with no save points. When the temperature dropped to 30 degrees below zero, it didn't gently decline like a leaf in the wind. It took a swan dive straight into misery. The cold back then wasn't passive. It had ambition. It had dreams. It had a full-time job. And that job was eliminating peasants one frostbitten toe at a time. And medieval cottages? Oh, those helped about as much as a wooden spoon in a sword fight. These homes were crafted using the finest materials available: mud, sticks, questionable hope, and the unwavering belief that maybe this won't collapse this year. The walls were a patchwork of wattle and daub, which sounds charming until you realise daub is medieval for whatever sticky substance we found on the ground. Insulation did not exist. Drafts did. Drafts were plentiful. Drafts were basically roommates. The wind loved visiting medieval cottages. It slipped in through every crack, crevice, and emotional weakness in the home's structure, swirling around the room like it was doing a surprise inspection. If you were wealthy enough to own a window, and by window I mean a hole cut into the wall, you covered it with cloth or wooden shutters that barely kept the cold out and mostly just flapped dramatically, like they were trying to warn you, you're not going to make it. Inside, the hearth was supposed to provide warmth. Instead, it produced smoke. Lots of smoke. Enough smoke to convince any visitor that the family inside had been politely charred. Hours ago, medieval peasants lived in a constant state of watery eyes, coughing fits, and confusion about whether the fire was helping or trying to suffocate everyone. Families slept packed together, not for bonding, but because human warmth was the only heating system that didn't cost money or require breaking any forest laws. Children weren't tucked in. They were strategically positioned like heat-generating livestock. If you were the youngest kid, congratulations. The medieval heating grid ran directly through you. Morning was the true test of survival. Stepping out of bed meant abandoning the only warmth left in your life. The water bucket, frozen. The floor, frozen. Your dreams, frozen. Even the bread had the texture of a hostile brick. Winter didn't just make life hard. It made life a negotiation. A negotiation peasants often lost. And that's exactly why they burned something unusual. You would assume that medieval peasants, surrounded by forests in every direction, would simply walk outside, pick up some logs, and enjoy a toasty fire like any sane, freezing human being. Ah, adorable. Truly precious. That level of optimism belongs in fairy tales and modern real estate listings. In reality, medieval peasants lived under a delightful system where almost everything belonged to someone else, usually a nobleman with a sword, a title, and the emotional range of a wet cabbage. Forests were not shared natural spaces. They were private, patrolled, and fiercely protected because they were sources of wealth. And when something is a source of wealth, peasants are legally forbidden from touching it. That's just medieval science. Peasants couldn't legally cut down trees. They couldn't chop branches. They couldn't gather logs. In some places, they couldn't even pick up a fallen stick without risking a fine, imprisonment, or a noble loudly announcing that their rights to firewood had been gravely violated. Imagine getting yelled at by a man who hasn't bathed since the reign of his grandfather. That was the peasant experience. Even collecting dead wood, the stuff already lying on the ground, doing nothing, contributing nothing, required permission. Not receiving permission was common. After all, why allow the people who grow your food to stay warm? Warm peasants might get ideas. Warm peasants might get confident.
With one of the coldest,
warm peasants might start asking for fair treatment.
Unintentionally hilarious
and we can't have that. So firewood became a luxury item. a status symbol. If your cottage smelled like actual burning wood rather than other substances, villagers assumed one of three things. You were rich, you were stealing, or you had bribed someone important with an unusually large chicken. Even when peasants did manage to get firewood, it was rarely good wood. Soft, wet, half-rotten pieces that hissed and smoked like a demon with lung problems. Firewood was so scarce that peasants rationed it carefully. A log here, a log there, and never enough to fight off the cold waiting outside like a hungry wolf. This wasn't simply inconvenient, it was dangerous. In the depths of winter, not having firewood meant waking up each morning unsure if the thread of warmth you clung to at night would return. The cold didn't gradually leak into their homes. It marched in boldly, declaring, "If you can't afford wood, I will simply take your soul instead." Firewood, in short, was not an option for most peasants, which is why they burned something far less glamorous. To understand why peasants froze while forests stood untouched, you have to understand one crucial truth about medieval society. The nobility adored forests, not because they needed oxygen, or enjoyed scenic walks like a modern yoga influencer, but because forests made money. And if there's anything a medieval lord loved more than inherited power and unnecessary violence, it was profit stacked on top of profit. Forests fed their wealth like a medieval financial portfolio. They provided timber for construction, fuel for industry, and most importantly, hunting grounds where nobles could gallop dramatically on horseback while yelling at deer. These hunts weren't just hobbies. They were social events, displays of masculinity, and opportunities to remind everyone, loudly, that peasants were not allowed to participate. For a noble, a forest was a treasure chest. For a peasant, it was a giant "do not touch" sign nailed directly onto nature. To make things even more charming, many nobles implemented strict forest laws that controlled every twig, branch, leaf, and suspiciously shaped shadow within their boundaries. These laws were so intense that in some regions, a peasant could get in trouble for merely looking like they were considering touching a tree. The punishment? Anything from fines to mutilation, depending on the lord's mood and whether he'd had breakfast yet. Nobles would rather let an entire forest rot than allow peasants to warm their homes with it. The idea that a peasant might think, that fallen log could save my family from freezing, was seen as dangerously rebellious. After all, peasants needed to remain cold, tired, and compliant, not warm, comfortable, and full of ideas. And of course, when winter arrived, nobles were fine. They had roaring hearths, multiple fireplaces, layered tapestries, fur blankets, and enough servants to keep the fire going non-stop. They could stroll around their halls in comfort, while peasants outside were debating whether toes were essential organs. The contrast was enormous. Nobility saw forests as symbols of prestige and resources for expansion. Peasants saw forests as giant, unreachable piles of warmth guarded by men who basically said, "You will freeze before I let you touch my precious logs." This wasn't ignorance or incompetence, it was intentional. A designed system that ensured peasants stayed dependent and cold, while lords enjoyed the luxury of burning as much wood as they pleased, and with wood locked behind layers of rules, punishments, and privilege, peasants turned to the next best thing, or depending on how you see it, the next worst thing. Once you accept that medieval peasants lived within walking distance of entire forests they weren't allowed to touch, everything starts to make sense, or at least medieval sense, which is a lower and more chaotic standard of logic. With firewood locked behind a wall of noble privilege, peasants were forced into a desperate game of what burns and how offended will God be if I set it on fire. The first alternative fuel source was dead vegetation, brambles, twigs, dried weeds, and anything growing in a hedgerow that wasn't guarded by a man with a sword. This wasn't firewood, this was nature's trash. It burned fast, burned weak, and burned out quicker than a medieval marriage with no dowry. But it was something. Next on the list were broken household items, worn-out stools, snapped wagon handles, tools that had splintered beyond repair. If it was wooden and no longer useful, it was going into the fire. Not because peasants were wasteful, they couldn't afford waste, but because the cold turned everyone into a pyromaniac with good intentions. Then there was thatch, which covered roofs and was technically flammable, but also technically necessary to avoid rain falling directly onto your bed. Burning thatch was an extreme choice, the medieval equivalent of selling your car to pay the electricity bill. A short-term victory, long-term catastrophe. Still, in the coldest winters, some families burned patched sections of old thatch and prayed their replacement section wouldn't collapse on their heads come spring. But eventually, peasants discovered the true MVP of medieval heating: animal droppings. And this wasn't a last resort. It was a reliable, renewable, and shockingly abundant resource. Every morning, the barnyard delivered fresh, steaming potential right to their doorstep. It didn't matter if the cow had opinions or the sheep had attitude. As long as they were eating, they were producing fuel. This was not seen as strange. This was survival. Medieval peasants didn't look at a pile of manure and think, "How disgusting." They looked at it the way modern people look at a Black Friday sale. If I don't take this now, someone else will, and I'll regret it. The logic became simple. If it burns, burn it. If it might burn, try burning it. If it looks like it shouldn't burn, definitely burn it. Peasants lived in a world where creativity wasn't a luxury. It was the only thing standing between them and the kind of cold that could freeze your soul into a historical artifact. And that's when dung stopped being waste and became fuel. Every medieval morning started the same way. A rooster crowed, someone groaned, someone else questioned the meaning of life, and the animals politely deposited the day's heating supply right onto the barn floor. In a world where firewood was forbidden and winter was actively trying to assassinate you, this wasn't an inconvenience. It was a blessing. A warm, steaming, slightly fragrant blessing. To a modern viewer, animal droppings are something you step around. To medieval peasants, they were currency renewable gold. The medieval version of passive income, except instead of stocks, you invested in livestock, and instead of dividends you got, well, patties. And business was booming. Cows were the most reliable fuel producers. Calm, slow, and generous, a cow could turn yesterday's grass into today's heating system with admirable efficiency. Horses followed closely behind. Though more selective in their output, they contributed their fair share. Sheep and goats, smaller payloads but high frequency, nature's way of providing installment payments. Peasant children were often tasked with collecting the morning fuel harvest. And no, they weren't traumatized. They didn't need therapy. They needed gloves that didn't exist yet. Kids learned early that the path to warmth ran directly through the barn. They'd wander out half awake, scoop up the goods, and carry them home like tiny underpaid energy workers. Adults did the same, but with more dignity, or at least the medieval approximation of dignity, which generally meant not slipping. A person carrying a basket of fresh manure while walking on icy ground needed perfect balance, strong legs, and absolutely no shame. If you fell, you didn't just lose your fuel, you lost your honour. The best part? No one judged you. Not your neighbours, not your family, not even the animals' medieval society was built on the understanding that survival was messy, and sometimes that mess steamed visibly in the cold morning air. And let's not pretend this was optional. If a village didn't collect enough fuel each day, the cold crept back in like a tax collector who'd heard a rumour you had a spare chicken hidden somewhere. So peasants embraced the inevitable. They made it part of the routine. Wake up, survive, eat something beige, collect dung. It was predictable, reliable, almost comforting. In the same way that watching your breath freeze indoors at dawn was comforting. The animals were more than livestock. They were the village's heating grid. And every morning, they delivered. Collecting the raw material was only step one. Turning it into something burnable, something dignified enough to place inside your home, required craftsmanship, patience, and a level of emotional detachment that only medieval life could teach you. First, the fresh dung had to be mixed with something fibrous, straw, chaff, dried grass, or whatever plant matter hadn't already been eaten by a goat with trust issues. This mixture gave the patties structure. In other words, it prevented them from collapsing into a sad, soggy heap of "we tried." Think of it like medieval pottery, except the clay was alive 5 minutes earlier. The mixing process itself was a meditative ritual. Kneading the warm, earthy mixture with your hands forced you to confront two universal truths. 1. Warmth is warmth even when it's suspicious. And 2. Medieval life did not care about your personal boundaries. Once the mixture reached the right consistency, not too wet, not too crumbly, and ideally only mildly horrifying, peasants shaped it into patties. These patties were perfectly circular, because humanity cannot resist making a neat little circle even when working with this material. Fashion varied from region to region. Some preferred thinner, faster-drying patties, while others favoured thick, slow-burning discs. It was like a medieval version of regional pizza styles, except absolutely no one was excited about it. Then came the drying stage. Imagine walking around a village and seeing hundreds of brown patties slapped onto every wall, fence, barn, and flat surface available. Travellers from the south sometimes assumed these were decorative. They were not. They were the community's future warmth, clinging to walls like very determined pancakes. Drying could take days or even weeks, depending on the weather. Sun was good. Wind was good. Rain was a catastrophic disaster that turned your hard work into an unholy slurry that slid down the wall like a medieval horror movie. If a storm was coming, villagers rushed outside to rescue their patties, scooping them up as if they were priceless relics instead of... Well, you know children sometimes turned the process into a competition, judging whose patties were the smoothest, biggest, or most perfectly shaped. Adults did not find this amusing, mostly because the children were usually correct. When fully dried, the patties transformed. They hardened into solid, burnable discs that could stack neatly like oversized medieval poker chips. Ugly? Yes. Smelly? Occasionally. Life-saving? Absolutely. These were no longer droppings. They were fuel. Handcrafted, artisanal, locally sourced medieval fuel. Drying dung cakes wasn't just a practical step. It was a public spectacle. The entire village saw your patties. Everyone judged your patties. In a world without entertainment, gossip, or indoor hobbies, watching your neighbour's fuel dry on their wall was basically medieval television. After shaping the patties, peasants slapped them onto every available surface. Cottage walls, barn sides, fences, gates, and sometimes even the neighbour's house, if they'd had an argument and wanted to subtly assert dominance. The goal was simple. Expose them to sun and wind until they hardened into something you wouldn't be ashamed to place inside your home. But here's the thing. Patties didn't always dry gracefully. Sometimes they drooped. Sometimes they sagged. Sometimes they slid down the wall in slow, tragic motion, leaving a smear that silently announced, "This family is having a difficult winter." Villagers took note. They always took note. A good patty was a point of pride. Smooth, symmetrical, firm, and evenly dried. A work of art, if your definition of art was aggressively flexible. Meanwhile, the neighbour with lumpy, cracked patties was silently judged as someone who lacked discipline, ambition, or properly fed animals. Rain was the ultimate enemy. A surprise storm could ruin days of work, turning carefully crafted patties into an unholy brown avalanche. When clouds gathered, peasants rushed outside in a panic, scooping the patties from the walls and piling them under shelter like priceless treasures. Imagine Beethoven rescuing his sheet music. Now replace the sheet music with steaming manure and you have the idea. Even the animals contributed to the chaos. Chickens, curious by nature and rude by personality, pecked at drying patties for fun. Dogs knocked over stacks. Goats, fueled by malice and chaos, occasionally ate them. If your goat devoured your winter fuel, that goat was eating cold leftovers for the rest of the season. The drying period also filled the village with an unmistakable scent. Warm earth, a hint of barnyard, and a suggestion of, "Don't breathe too deeply near the walls." Travellers passing through often described the aroma as rustic, natural, or aggressively local. Despite the mess, the embarrassment, and the constant threat of weather-related disasters, drying patties was essential. A properly dried dung cake burned longer, hotter, and cleaner, relatively speaking, than any wet stick peasants could risk gathering. And once those patties were ready, it was time to bring them inside, because nothing said cosy medieval home like a neat stack of hardened barn gifts stored lovingly by the hearth. At some point, we have to confront the medieval elephant in the room, or rather, the medieval cow in the fireplace. The smell. Because yes, burning dung has an aroma, a personality, a presence. It's not the polite scent of pine wood drifting gently through the air. It's not the cosy smell of fresh-baked bread. It is the unmistakable fragrance of survival, sprinkled with a generous pinch of don't ask questions. When a dung fire burned, it didn't politely whisper its scent into the cottage. It announced itself. Boldly. It crept into your clothes, your hair, your blankets, your soul. Visitors could identify which villages used dung fires long before they arrived, usually by sniffing the breeze and saying, "Ah, they're warming themselves today." But here's the surprising part. Peasants didn't actually mind. When you live in a reality where winter is actively trying to assassinate you every night, your standard for what counts as a problem becomes remarkably selective. A little barnyard aroma? Fine. A slightly smoky flavour in tonight's porridge? Acceptable. The cottage air feeling like a combination of earth, hearth smoke, and something barn-adjacent? Barely worth mentioning. In fact, medieval people described the smell in shockingly positive terms. Chroniclers wrote phrases like earthy, natural, and warm, which is historian language for, "I'm trying very hard not to say what this actually smells like." Travellers passing through peasant homes often described the ambience as thick, rustic, or comfortably smoky, which translates to, "I will be remembering this smell for the rest of my life." Inside the home, the family adjusted. After the first few minutes, the human nose surrendered, waved a little white flag and said, "You know what? Let's just pretend this is fine." Meanwhile, the smoke itself had ambitions of its own. Medieval chimneys were more concept than functional, and smoke loved drifting sideways, sinking down, or hovering in the room like an unwanted guest with poor social skills. But, and this is the shocking part, the smell came with one huge perk. Insects hated it. Fleas, lice, mosquitoes, whatever tiny creature was trying to ruin your day. They despised dung smoke. The cottage might smell like a barn on fire, but at least your skin wasn't being used as an all-you-can-eat buffet. The smell wasn't pleasant, but it was protective. It wasn't pretty, but it meant warmth. And warmth, in a world colder than 30 degrees below zero, was priceless. So yes, medieval peasants burned dung. And yes, it filled their homes with a scent that would horrify modern homeowners. But for them, survival always outranked aesthetics. For all the jokes, the smells, the wall-mounted patties, and the questionable life choices involved. Here's the twist medieval peasants would like us to remember. Burning dung actually worked. Not barely worked, not kind of worked, but genuinely worked. Reliably, consistently, and often better than the sad excuses for firewood they were sometimes allowed to collect. Dung, especially cow dung, burns slowly and steadily. Not dramatically, not romantically. It doesn't produce those cinematic crackling sparks you see in movies. Instead, it burns the way medieval peasants lived, quietly, stubbornly, and against all odds. You could stack a few dung cakes into the hearth, light them, and they'd smoulder for hours like a determined old man, refusing to leave a tavern at closing time. And that slow burn was exactly what a medieval cottage needed. These homes weren't spacious. They weren't insulated. They were glorified boxes that leaked heat in every direction, so a fire that stayed alive for hours, even if it smelled like the back end of a barn, was a blessing. A humble, smoky, slightly offensive blessing. Dung also had another secret advantage. It burned hotter than most of the legal wood peasants were allowed to touch fallen branches. Rotten logs and half-decayed brush burned quickly and produced minimal heat. Some were so wet they hissed in the fire like they were personally offended to be there. But dung cakes? They burned with the calm confidence of fuel that knew it was doing you a favour. Weirdly enough, dried dung also produced less dangerous popping embers than wood. This meant fewer accidental fires, fewer panic moments, fewer "is the roof on fire?" mornings. In a world made of flammable thatch roofs and walls held together by hope, this was a big deal. On top of that, dung smoke, while not going to win any awards for fragrance, did have medicinal and preservative effects. The constant stream of warm smoke drifting through the cottage helped dry clothes, preserved food, and even disinfected the air in a, let's call it a medieval way. Sure, you wouldn't want to bottle it as a perfume, but fleas and pests certainly hated it. The peasants understood something profound. Fire wasn't about luxury. It was about staying alive. And dung, for all its humble origins, performed that duty better than anyone expected. So yes, they burned dung. Not because it was pleasant, not because it was fashionable, but because when winter tries to erase you from existence, you use whatever burns even if it used to moo. If you think dung fires were only used for heating, you underestimate medieval multitasking. Peasants didn't have the luxury of separate appliances. There was no heating system here and cooking system there. No, in a proper medieval household, one smoky, questionable, slightly aromatic fire handled everything. Warmth, cooking, drying clothes, fumigating insects, and occasionally forcing guests to rethink their life decisions. But here's the surprising twist. Dung fires were fantastic for cooking. Not in a Michelin star way, unless Michelin starts awarding stars for consistent simmering despite barnyard undertones, but in a practical, life-sustaining way. Dung doesn't burn with fierce drama. It doesn't roar or spit sparks. Instead, it produces slow, steady, reliable heat, the exact kind of heat you want when you're boiling a pot of barley for the 7th day in a row. Peasants ate meals that required patience, not precision. Porridges, stews, broths, and anything you could throw into a pot and forget about while you spent the rest of the day not freezing to death. A dung fire could keep a cauldron simmering for hours, gently gurgling away like it was humming medieval lullabies. This slow cooking method softened grains, tenderized tough meat scraps, and blended flavors so thoroughly that the result was almost tasty, or at least less depressing. And unlike wood fires, dung didn't scorch the bottom of the pot with sudden flare-ups. There were no shocking bursts of heat that turned dinner into a charcoal sculpture. The worst that could happen was the stew absorbing a faint hint of barn ambiance, which everyone in the cottage was already breathing anyway. In fact, many medieval households preferred dung fires for cooking. They were stable, predictable, cooperative, the kind of fire you trusted to watch the pot while you ran outside to yell at a goose for stealing laundry. Dung fires also played a secret role in food safety. The constant warm smoke drifting through the cottage helped dry herbs, preserve meats, and chase away microbes long before anyone understood what microbes were. If you hung sausage near the hearth, it dried faster. If you placed cheese on a shelf above the fire, it developed a firm rind instead of a thriving village of bacteria. And perhaps most importantly, the smell of cooking masked the smell of burning dung. If the stew was thick, hearty, and bubbling away, the cottage smelled more like rustic broth and less like someone set fire to the barn floor. To medieval peasants, this wasn't weird. This was efficiency. This was survival. This was their slow cooker, fueled by yesterday's cow. If you're imagining medieval children reacting to dung collection duty with horror, disgust, or emotional trauma, you're giving them way too much credit. These were not modern children raised on cartoons, tablets, and indoor plumbing. These were children who considered a stick the peak of entertainment technology. For them, collecting animal droppings wasn't revolting. It was Tuesday. From the moment a child could walk without face-planting into a puddle of mud, they were drafted into the household fuel production team. No training, no warning, no gentle onboarding process. One day you're wobbling around the cottage chewing on a piece of straw. The next day someone hands you a small wooden scoop and says, "Go fetch the warm stuff." And they did. Happily. Cheerfully. With the unearned confidence of youth. Little children toddled out into the barn at dawn, half awake and wrapped in oversized wool tunics, ready to collect the morning's fresh delivery. They knew every animal by personality. They knew which cow ate too much, which goat aimed its droppings with malicious intent, and which horse had a talent for producing fuel-rich masterpieces the size of a dinner roll. To them, dung wasn't waste. It was warmth. It was survival. It was the difference between shivering through a 30 degrees below zero night and feeling your fingers the next morning. Kids weren't squeamish. They were practical. Picking up patties meant comfort. Avoiding it meant freezing. It wasn't a moral choice. It was physics. Some children even gamified the whole process, because of course they did. Who could collect the most? Who found the biggest piece? Who could shape the smoothest patty? Entire sibling rivalries were built on these competitions, and yes, arguments broke out. Many childhood feuds began with the sentence, "You stole my dung pile." And while adults approached drying and storing patties with seriousness, children applied creativity. They decorated patties with handprints. They arranged them into patterns on the wall. They invented dung art long before any museum curator could question their sanity. Of course, accidents happened. A child would slip on ice while holding a full basket, landing dramatically in a situation that tested their will to live. Parents rushed out, not because they worried about injury, but because losing a basket full of fresh fuel was a catastrophe. "Are you hurt?" was always followed by, "But did the patties survive?" By the time these children grew up, handling dung was as instinctive as breathing. They didn't flinch. They didn't complain. They didn't think twice. To them, this wasn't strange. This was normal. This was life. And winter survival depended on every handful. Just when you thought medieval peasants couldn't get more creative with what they burned, allow me to introduce peat, the dark, muddy, ancient cousin of firewood that peasants relied on whenever they lived near marshes, bogs, or any patch of earth that looked like it wanted to swallow a cow whole. Peat wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable, and that alone made it a superstar. Peat is essentially compressed plant matter that decided to spend a few centuries underground, becoming dense, flammable bricks of not quite coal, not quite soil, but definitely burnable. To peasants, peat was a gift from nature, specifically from nature's soggy, unpleasant regions. While the wealthy burned timber in their grand halls, peasants trudged out into the bogs armed with shovels and unearned optimism. Cutting peat was a whole adventure. You trudged out into a landscape that was half earth, half water, and half quicksand. Yes, that's 3 halves. Welcome to medieval mathematics. Each step was a gamble. Would you sink a little? A lot? Would you lose a shoe and have to decide whether to retrieve it or accept that the bog now owned it? Once you reached the cutting spot, you carved out bricks of peat using a special spade. These bricks were heavy, wet, and deeply committed to ruining your clothing. You stacked them in neat piles to dry, because much like dung, peat only burns properly when you've removed all the excess swamp juice. Drying peat required patience, weeks of it. During this time, your neatly arranged bricks sat in the open, waiting for the sun to dry them, and for livestock to not trample them. Chickens, sheep, and goats saw drying peat as an invitation, a new playground, a new thing to stand on, kick over, or chew experimentally. Medieval animals had no respect for personal boundaries or winter necessities, but once dried, peat was magnificent. It produced a slow, even burn, hotter than dung, cooler than high-quality wood, and significantly less smelly than the barn-based alternative peat smoke had its own scent, somewhere between earthy forest and the ground after rain, which, compared to burning dung, felt like a luxury spa fragrance. Peat also lasted a long time. A few bricks could heat a home through the night, reducing how often you needed to trudge into the cold to gather more. In regions like Ireland and Scotland, Peat wasn't just a fuel source. It was a cultural icon, a centuries-long tradition, and a reliable friend in the winter's battle against the cold. So yes, medieval peasants burned peat. Not because they loved mud, but because peat burned beautifully, and never complained. In the modern world, you adjust a thermostat, maybe press a button, and voila, warmth. In the medieval world, heating your home wasn't a button. It wasn't even a chore. It was a lifestyle, a full-time occupation, a never-ending battle against a cold that absolutely woke up each morning choosing violence. From dawn until night, winter survival was a cycle of gathering, shaping, drying, burning, and desperately hoping nothing went wrong. If you were a medieval peasant, you didn't prepare for winter. You wrestled with it daily, the way a sleep-deprived parent wrestles with a toddler determined to cause chaos. Everything began with fuel collection, a stylish morning stroll to find yesterday's droppings, gather brittle weeds, retrieve fallen brambles, or, if you were very lucky, find a small forgotten stick that the Lord's forester hadn't personally screamed at someone for touching. Then you returned home and shaped patties, stacked peat, or sorted kindling like a medieval squirrel with emotional baggage. Next came the fire itself. Lighting a fire wasn't as simple as striking a match. There were no matches. There was flint, steel, and a level of patience normally reserved for saints. You scraped until sparks flew, prayed they landed somewhere useful, and shielded the tiny flame from drafts as if protecting a newborn child from assassins. And once the fire was lit, congratulations, you now had to babysit it all day. Dung fires smouldered gently, which was great for warmth, but terrible for anyone who wanted to leave the cottage for more than 12 seconds. Wander off too long, and you'd return to a cold hearth glaring at you in betrayal. Peat required turning, rearranging, and strategic stacking. Wet brambles hissed and crackled, like they were offended to be burning in the first place. Everything needed attention. And at night? Oh, night was the true test. You couldn't let the fire go out, because relighting it in the frozen morning was torture on a spiritual level. So families banked the coals under ash, tucked them in like sleeping babies, whispered encouragement, and hoped to every saint in the calendar that the embers would still be alive by dawn, but sometimes they weren't. And you would wake up to a cottage colder than a nobleman's heart, breath freezing in the air, water solid in the bucket, and the realization that your day was about to be consumed by starting the entire heating process over again. In medieval winter, fire wasn't warmth. It was work. Relentless, exhausting, dignity-destroying work. And peasants fought that battle every single day. In the medieval world, your social class wasn't just written in law or stamped on tax records. It was smelled. That's right. A visitor entering a village didn't need to ask who was wealthy and who wasn't. They simply sniffed the air like an overconfident wine critic and said, "Ah, this cottage burns peat. These folks have taste." Meanwhile, the home's burning dung gave off a more agriculturally expressive aroma. The truth was simple. In a medieval village, your fuel source doubled as your social resume. If your cottage smelled faintly of peat, you were doing well. Peat wasn't fancy, but it burned cleaner than dung, lasted longer, and didn't make the inside of your home smell like a warm barn. Peat was respectable fuel, practical, middle class, the "I can't afford timber, but I'm not freezing either" option. If your home smelled like firewood, however, real firewood, the good stuff that snapped and crackled and smelled like a forest instead of a stable, people assumed you were one of two things: wealthy or a criminal. And honestly, the line between those two categories was thin. Anyone burning proper logs was either a noble, a church institution, or that one villager who mysteriously had fallen branches every single day and absolutely no explanation for how they kept finding them. Everyone knew they were poaching wood, but no one said anything because snitching meant you might lose the chance to borrow a log during emergencies. But if your cottage smelled like dung smoke, you were normal. Wretchedly normal. Comfortingly normal. Dung was the great equalizer, the fuel of the masses. It didn't matter if you were hard-working, respectable, honest, or devoted to your family. If your home smelled like the south end of a northbound ox, people assumed you belonged to the majority, broke, cold, and trying your best. Some villagers even found a twisted pride in it. Ah, yes, that's our smell. The smell of survival. And the nobles? They had opinions, of course. They often described the scent of dung-burning cottages as rustic, earthy, or evidence of poor breeding, depending on how bored they were. They never had to smell like this personally. Their fireplaces were fed with logs the size of tree trunks, hauled in by servants who were freezing on behalf of their employer. Fuel smell became a kind of social language. A code, a hierarchy. Dung, poor but surviving. Peat, modest comfort. Wood, wealthy or guilty. And if your cottage smelled like nothing, you were either lying or already frozen. In medieval society, you didn't just burn fuel. You wore it on your clothes, in your hair, and in your reputation. Being a king in the Middle Ages wasn't simply about wearing a shiny crown and sitting on a throne that looked like it was built to ruin your spine. It was a full-time performance, a fragile balancing act between divine authority, political theatre, and the constant fear that half the people in the banquet hall wanted your job. A medieval king was marketed as God's chosen representative on earth, but in practice, he was just a very stressed-out landlord with an army. The king controlled land, which meant wealth, which meant power. In theory, every field, forest, and muddy village belonged to him. In reality, his ownership depended on whether the nobles actually listened, and medieval nobles listened about as well as toddlers hyped up on honeycakes. Still, the king embodied law itself. If he said something was illegal, it was illegal. If he said something was legal, congratulations, it was legal, even if 5 minutes earlier it had been a hanging offence. But royal power was not the carefree, I command, you obey fantasy modern movies love to portray. It came with a constant background hum of danger. Foreign rivals wanted your borders. Noble families wanted your throne. Your relatives wanted your crown. Even the church occasionally wanted to remind you that your authority came from their blessing. A king could go from God's chosen ruler to accidentally fell down some stairs during dinner, faster than you could say, "Long live the king." Royal etiquette was its own battlefield. One wrong bow, one misplaced banner, one noble showing up at court with a sword that was a little too shiny. All these could be interpreted as disrespect, or worse, rebellion. Kings had to read gestures the way fortune-tellers read tea leaves. If a duke refused wine at dinner, was he simply not thirsty? Or was he signalling a political insult that could ignite a war? And yet, despite the stress, kings projected an image of invincible authority. The throne room was carefully staged. Towering ceilings, echoing halls, elaborate robes, and enough gold embroidery to blind a small town. Everything reminded visitors, especially nobles, that they were standing before someone who could reward loyalty with land, or punish disobedience with a swift visit from the royal executioner. Being a medieval king wasn't glamorous. It was dangerous. It was exhausting. But it was the top of the food chain, and everyone below you knew it. If kings were the apex predators of medieval politics, dukes were the wolves lurking just below them. Powerful, territorial, and always testing the fences. A duke controlled a duchy, which was essentially a mini-kingdom with all the drama, backstabbing, and political scheming, just without the crown that said, "God wants me here." Dukes didn't rule the realm, but they ruled their realm, and sometimes that distinction felt dangerously thin. Dukes were not polite little vassals who waited patiently for royal orders. These were men who commanded armies larger than some entire kingdoms. They had their own courts, their own laws, and in many cases, more money than the king himself. If a duke hosted a feast, it wasn't just dinner, it was a strategic display of power. The number of servants, the amount of wine, the gold plates, the musicians hired from 4 countries away, all carefully chosen to say, I'm important, and I know you know I'm important, and kings did know. Oh, they knew. Because a disgruntled duke was not merely an inconvenience, he was a potential civil war in human form. If a duke felt slighted, perhaps he didn't get the marriage alliance he wanted, or the king looked at him funny during council. He could muster thousands of knights by the end of the week. Medieval kings treated dukes like someone juggling lit torches while standing on an oil barrel. Fascinating to watch. Terrifying to handle, dukes also played the long game. They arranged marriages not for romance, but for land grabs. They formed alliances with other nobles the same way modern people form group chats, except these group chats sometimes ended with catapults. Some dukes quietly collected favours, debts, and loyalties, until one day they woke up and realised they had enough power to challenge the king. Several actually did. Many came close. A few even succeeded. In day-to-day life, dukes acted like regional monarchs. They hosted court sessions, judged disputes, collected taxes, and expected absolute obedience from everyone on their land. Their banners flew over castle walls like territorial flags, reminding everyone that stepping into a duchy meant stepping into a duke's personal kingdom. But ambition was both their gift and curse. A duke could rise to incredible heights, but one miscalculated rebellion, one insult to the wrong royal cousin, or one suspiciously timed hunting accident, and his duchy could be erased overnight, because being second in line to power meant one thing. You were always close enough to reach the throne or fall from it. If dukes were the ambitious regional bosses of the Middle Ages, counts were the slightly exhausted department managers stuck between two worlds. Powerful enough to matter, but not powerful enough to sleep peacefully. A count ruled a county, land, villages, forests, taxes, soldiers, basically everything except the right to pretend he was almost a king. Counts were the glue that held medieval kingdoms together, though they would never describe themselves that way. They saw themselves as underappreciated heroes in a world full of egos wearing crowns. Unlike dukes, who strutted around like they were born for greatness, counts operated under a constant awareness. The king needs me, but he shouldn't think I know he needs me. So they walked a tightrope too loyal, and they became irrelevant, too independent, and the king arrived with an army and some polite but firm questions about their taxes. Counts dealt with everything. Crime? Their problem. Roads falling apart? Their problem. Peasants rioting because the last harvest failed? Definitely their problem. They were responsible for raising troops when the king called, which meant dragging local knights away from their comfortable halls and convincing peasants that marching into battle was somehow in their personal interest. It rarely was. Still, counts held real authority. They collected revenues, dispensed justice, and ruled from their castles like miniature monarchs, just with fewer tapestries and definitely fewer musicians. Their courthouses were where disputes were settled, land claims argued, and unlucky criminals learned what medieval justice really meant. Spoiler, it wasn't gentle. Politically, counts were the swing votes of the medieval hierarchy. When a duke got too bold, the king often turned to counts to keep the balance. "Support me," the king would say. "For the good of the realm," he would add, as if anyone believed that line. But counts understood the game. They could tip the scales in noble feuds, decide border conflicts, and occasionally, if the timing was perfect, expand their lands by stepping into another noble's misfortune. Yet they lived with permanent anxiety. Too successful and a jealous duke might march in. Too weak, and the king might replace them with someone more competent or more obedient. A count's life was like trying to maintain order in a tavern full of knights who had been drinking since sunrise. Chaotic, loud, and one argument away from total disaster. But despite the stress, counts held their ground. Because in the medieval pyramid of power, they weren't just the middle. They were the centre that everything else leaned on. If counts were the overworked middle managers of medieval nobility, then viscounts were the unfortunate assistant managers who handled all the same headaches, but with half the credit. A viscount didn't rule the county outright. He helped rule it, which in medieval terms meant doing the hard work while the count took the glory. Their job title literally meant Viscount, which should tell you everything about how medieval society viewed them. They were important, necessary, and absolutely taken for granted. Most Viscounts began their day handling the tasks the Count didn't want to think about. Tax disputes, land arguments, rogue knights with too much free time, jurisdictional squabbles, and peasants who insisted on complaining about things like famine and wolves. If the county ran smoothly, everyone praised the Count. If the county fell apart, everyone blamed the Viscount. It was a flawless system, assuming you weren't the Viscount. Viscounts often governed large stretches of land on behalf of the Count, especially when the Count was busy doing more noble things like hunting, hosting feasts, or trying not to offend the king. This meant the Viscount travelled constantly, inspecting villages, holding courts, and issuing orders to local officials. He had authority, but it came with a leash attached, one tug from the Count, and everything changed. Despite their junior status, Viscounts wielded real power. They could administer justice, levy certain taxes, and command forces in the Count's name. But make no mistake, their power was borrowed, not owned. If they misused it, the Count could strip it away with a sentence as brief as, "We need to have a talk." In medieval politics, that was usually followed by exile, imprisonment, or a sudden hunting accident. Still, Viscounts were often ambitious. Many used their role to build alliances with knights, minor nobles, and even church officials. They knew the county's problems better than anyone, which also meant they understood exactly where influence could be carved out. Some Viscounts quietly expanded their wealth, married into strategic families, or positioned themselves as indispensable advisors. A few even rose high enough that their descendants eventually became counts, but most lived in a cycle of endless responsibility and limited reward. They were close enough to taste power, yet never close enough to claim it fully. A Viscount's life was a medieval reminder of a timeless truth. Sometimes the one doing the work is not the one wearing the crown, or even the fancy hat. Barons were the bedrock of medieval nobility. The boots-on-the-ground enforcers, who made sure the king's grand plans didn't fall apart the moment anyone left the castle. If kings commanded kingdoms and dukes ran duchies, barons ruled something far more unpredictable: human nature. Their estates were smaller, but their responsibilities were enormous. A baron didn't just govern land, he governed the daily chaos of feudal life. A baron's domain might include a handful of villages, a modest castle, and a couple of forests filled with poachers who pretended they had no idea hunting was forbidden. While counts and dukes dealt with large-scale politics, barons dealt with the problems that arrived covered in mud, shouting about stolen chickens. They were the nobility who actually faced the kingdom's messy reality. Barons held their land directly from the king, or from a higher noble, depending on the region, and in return, they owed military service. When war broke out, a baron didn't have the luxury of politely sending a letter. He had to assemble knights, levy peasants, gather supplies, and march out immediately. Predictably, most barons spent their lives preparing for conflicts that often started because someone somewhere insulted the wrong banner. Their authority extended into local justice, which meant they presided over manorial courts. These weren't the grand royal courts, filled with velvet robes and polished marble. No, baronial courts took place in drafty halls where decisions were made based on testimony, custom, and the baron's mood that morning. Trial by ordeal also remained popular, proving that questioning medieval logic is a pointless exercise. But despite their rugged environment, barons held power that mattered. They could grant land to knights, demand labour from peasants, enforce taxes, and build fortifications. They were the essential gears that kept feudalism turning. Without barons, the entire system would collapse faster than a wooden bridge in a rainstorm. Socially, they struck a middle ground. Too low-ranked to challenge the great lords, but too important to be ignored. Barons were constantly defending their rights, negotiating with counts, and preventing minor disputes from becoming major wars. Their influence came from proximity. They were always there, always watching, always enforcing. Barons didn't wield vast territories or command huge armies. but they were irreplaceable. They were the men who turned royal edicts into actual reality, who settled the everyday disputes of the medieval world, and who kept order in an age where order never lasted long. They weren't the grandest nobles, but they were the backbone, sturdy, stubborn, and absolutely essential. Knights are often remembered as gallant heroes charging across open fields, banners flying, sunlight glinting off polished armour. Medieval reality, however, was less glamorous and more exhausting. A knight was essentially a heavily armed land manager with a side job as a shock trooper. Their loyalty was purchased with land, titles, and the promise that if they died gloriously in battle, someone might write a mildly flattering poem about them. A knight's status was built on one thing: service. He didn't rise through political schemes like a duke, or drown in paperwork like a viscount. Knights earned their rank by fighting, properly, consistently, and without running away when things got loud. In return for their courage, a baron or count granted them a fief, which was basically a chunk of land and the peasants living on it. The peasants provided food and labour, the knight provided muscle. It was feudalism's most straightforward trade agreement. But knighthood demanded constant readiness. Armour didn't maintain itself, horses didn't train themselves, and swords didn't magically sharpen overnight. A knight spent much of his life preparing, drilling with weapons, patrolling borders, settling petty disputes, and making sure no one stole his cows. Movies show knights galloping majestically into battle. Medieval knights spent more time arguing with blacksmiths, scolding squires, and paying taxes on everything from grain to gates. In courtly settings, knights were expected to act noble. They learned manners, music, poetry, and the fine art of not embarrassing their lord at feasts. But beneath the chivalric rituals, they remained warriors at heart, trained to follow orders, defend their lord's interests, and, when necessary, charge head first into situations a sane person would avoid. Knights were also political tools. A lord with many loyal knights was powerful. A lord with unhappy knights was doomed. Knights could sway local politics, support rebellions, or crush them. Their presence at a manor reinforced order. Their absence often invited chaos. Yet for all their prestige, knights lived with constant pressure. A bad harvest meant their fief suffered. A lost battle meant shame. A displeased baron meant eviction. And chivalry, the grand code everyone admired, was more idealized than practiced. Many knights lived honorably. Many more lived realistically. Still, knights were crucial. They embodied feudal strength, disciplined, armoured, relentless. They were the steel backbone of noble armies and the visible reminder that power in the Middle Ages didn't just sit on thrones. It rode into battle. They weren't kings, dukes, or counts. But when war came, they were the first to charge and the last to retreat. Below the armoured prestige of knights stood a group of nobles who lived in the hazy middle ground between influence and irrelevance. These were the lesser nobles, minor lords, petty landholders, castellans, and hereditary troublemakers who owned land too small to brag about but too important to ignore. They weren't powerful enough to command armies or negotiate treaties, yet they weren't simple peasants either. They lived in a perpetual state of trying to climb the ladder while pretending they already belonged at the top. A lesser noble might control a single village, a manor house, or a strategically meaningless patch of forest. Their titles varied by region. Some were called lords, some gentlemen, some castellans, but their jobs were depressingly similar. Keep order, collect rents, maintain the estate, and make sure no one stole the livestock. They were the nobility's middle class, forever juggling responsibilities with limited resources. Their biggest asset was proximity. They lived close to their people and closer still to their problems. They saw the harvest failures, the disputes over fences, the unpaid tithes, and the neighbour who kept insisting his cow wandered, accidentally, into someone else's field. While counts and dukes handled politics, lesser nobles handled human chaos. But these smaller nobles also had ambitions, big ones. Many dreamed of marrying upward, expanding their land, or catching the eye of a more powerful lord. A flattering letter to a baron, a strategic marriage alliance, or heroic service in battle could launch a family upward in a single generation. They knew this, so they played the long game. Every feast attended, every banner carried, every favour granted was a calculated step up the social staircase. Still, their reality was humble. A lesser noble's castle was often just a fortified manor with more draughty corners than defensive features. Their household staff was small but hard-working, and their daily routine included mediating neighbourly squabbles, resolving inheritance disputes, and convincing peasants that taxes were somehow absolutely necessary for the good of the realm. Despite their limited influence, they were vital to feudal stability. They formed the backbone of local governance, filling in the gaps that higher nobles ignored. They kept the roads safe, ensured tithes reached the right hands, and served as the first line of defence when raiders appeared on the horizon. Lesser nobles didn't shape kingdoms, but they shaped everyday life. They were the foot soldiers of aristocracy, the quiet administrators, the local authorities who kept the medieval world turning even when no one bothered to thank them. They weren't mighty, they weren't powerless, they were essential. If medieval society were a grand, glittering tapestry of nobility, then sergeants and household officers were the strong, stubborn threads holding the whole thing together. These men weren't nobles in the glamorous sense. They didn't host feasts, own vast duchies, or march around in gold-trimmed cloaks. Instead, they were the professional class of medieval power, trained fighters, administrators, and specialists who made noble households function with something resembling order. A sergeant wasn't a knight, but he was also definitely not a random peasant with a stick. Think of him as the medieval equivalent of a highly skilled contractor. Some sergeants were well-trained soldiers responsible for defending castles, patrolling borders, and backing up knights in battle. They carried spears, crossbows, or swords, wore decent armour, and did all the dangerous work knights preferred to delegate when possible. A knight might ride gloriously into battle. A sergeant held the line, took the hits, and made sure things didn't collapse. Other sergeants were specialists: castle gatekeepers, bridge wardens, messengers, mounted couriers, and professional guards trusted with keys to rooms full of things nobles didn't want stolen. They were the men nobles relied on when they needed something done reliably, especially tasks that required less bragging and more competence. Then there were the household officers, the administrators who actually kept noble households from devolving into chaos. The steward oversaw finances and estate management. The marshal handled stables and military organisation. The bailiff enforced local laws and collected rents, often while being shouted at by angry villagers. And the chamberlain managed the lord's private quarters, essentially functioning as the medieval personal assistant with keys to everything, including secrets. These officers didn't wield power through birthright, but through expertise. A good steward could increase a baron's wealth more than a dozen tax edicts. A competent marshal could turn a ragtag militia into a functioning defence force. A trusted chamberlain could whisper information that changed political outcomes, and nobles knew their worth. Many household officers earned enough respect to secure comfortable lives, sometimes even receiving small land grants. Some rose high enough for their children to join the lower ranks of nobility. They lived in a strange limbo, respected, relied upon, yet not quite noble. They were the glue, the gears, the quiet professionals who kept the realm functioning. Knights may have charged into glory, dukes may have schemed in castles, but sergeants and officers kept the entire machine from collapsing every single day. They were the Middle Ages' unsung professionals, steady, skilled, and absolutely essential. By the time you reach the bottom of the noble ladder, you realize something important. Medieval society wasn't a pyramid. It wasn't even a ladder. It was a spider web, sticky, fragile, interdependent, and populated by creatures that all secretly wanted to eat each other. Every rank relied on the others, and every rank feared the others. The king feared rebellion. Dukes feared kings. Counts feared dukes. Barons feared taxes. Knights feared dishonour. Lesser nobles feared poverty. Sergeants feared everyone. And peasants? Well, peasants feared wolves, famine, taxes, and waking up to discover someone had declared war again. This web was not built on trust. It was built on obligation. A noble's survival depended on fulfilling duties, swearing loyalty upward, offering protection downward, and hoping sideways alliances didn't explode. Feudal bonds were made through oaths thick enough to feel sacred but flexible enough to be broken when convenient. A count swore loyalty to his king until the king angered him. A baron promised support to his lord unless a better offer arrived. Chivalry and honour were the official rules. Opportunism was the actual rule-book. Land was the currency of power. Every acre held value, not just economically but symbolically. Owning land meant having peasants. Peasants meant taxes. Taxes meant soldiers. Soldiers meant leverage. And leverage meant the king had to smile politely when you entered his hall instead of throwing you into a dungeon. But for all its flaws, feudalism worked. Or at least, it worked as well as any system designed in an era where bathing was considered optional. The ranks of nobility functioned like gears in a massive machine. Kings issued laws that dukes ignored, that counts interpreted, that barons enforced, that knights carried out, that lesser nobles supervised, and that sergeants executed. Everyone played a part, unwillingly or not. Power flowed downward in the form of commands. Responsibility flowed upward in the form of taxes, military service, and endless apologies. A single insult could trigger a feud. A single marriage could rewrite a political map. The entire system depended on carefully balanced relationships. Loyalty mixed with suspicion, duty mixed with ambition, fear mixed with pride. In the end, the medieval world wasn't defined by kings or castles. It was defined by relationships, a constant negotiation of status, honour, and survival. You weren't just born into a rank. You were born into a centuries-long argument over what that rank meant. And in that argument, every noble, from the king to the humblest household officer, played their role in the great chaotic theatre of medieval power. Hatshepsut entered the world with royalty in her blood, and destiny stitched into her very name. As the daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I and his powerful queen, Ahmose, she was raised inside the palace walls, like someone who was never meant to live an ordinary life. In ancient Egypt, princes were groomed to inherit the throne. Princesses, not so much. Their job was to marry strategically and produce political stability. But Hatshepsut didn't behave like someone preparing for a ceremonial life spent in the shadow of men. Even as a child, she walked with the quiet certainty of someone who believed the throne was not just a possibility. It was her natural element. Egyptian royalty didn't receive a gentle upbringing, but Hatshepsut's education was intense even by palace standards. She learned hieroglyphics, mathematics, theology, and statecraft. She studied religious law and memorized sacred rituals normally reserved for future pharaohs. When she accompanied her father at ceremonies, she didn't just stand behind him, she observed. She listened. She absorbed every detail of leadership with a seriousness that made the old priests raise their eyebrows. Many in the palace began to whisper that she wasn't simply the king's daughter, she was the king's favourite student. Then came her politically convenient marriage to her half-brother, Thutmose II. It was standard practice for Egyptian royalty to marry within the family, but this union carried a deeper calculation. For the dynasty to remain pure, and for the throne to remain stable, Hatshepsut was the only suitable bride. Her marriage tied her even tighter to the future of Egypt. When she became great royal wife, her authority rose, but technically, she still had no claim to rule alone. But life had its own plans. When Thutmose II died young, the throne passed to a child, Thutmose III, a boy too young to rule. And suddenly, all eyes turned to Hatshepsut, not as a queen, but as a regent, a caretaker, a temporary stand-in for power. Except Hatshepsut didn't step in like a placeholder. She stepped in like a ruler who had been waiting her entire life for exactly this crack in the system. She had the bloodline, the education, and the political instincts. More importantly, she had the confidence of priests, scribes, and high officials, people who mattered far more than public opinion. The rules said a woman couldn't be pharaoh. Hatshepsut's entire childhood had prepared her to prove the rules wrong. When Thutmose II died and left only a young child as heir, the Egyptian court braced for instability. A kingdom as vast and wealthy as Egypt needed a steady hand, not a toddler with a ceremonial crown slipping over his eyes. So Hatshepsut stepped forward as regent, the adult meant to govern until Thutmose III grew old enough to rule. It sounded temporary, simple, and familiar. Many queens before her had served as regents during a prince's childhood, but Hatshepsut was not like the queens before her. She began her regency with calm competence. She performed rituals flawlessly, presided over administrative meetings, and stabilized a court shaken by the death of a pharaoh. Officials who expected a soft-spoken caretaker instead found someone who carried authority like a cloak thrown over her shoulders from birth. She spoke with confidence, made decisions quickly, and understood Egypt's complicated bureaucracy better than most men in the room. Within months, something became clear. Egypt wasn't just surviving under her leadership. It was thriving. That was when things started to shift. One title after another began attaching itself to her name. She took on responsibilities normally reserved for the pharaoh, not his stand-in. She appeared in royal ceremonies not behind the young king, but beside him. Slowly, subtly, she stepped into a position no woman was meant to occupy, and the court noticed. Priests, especially those of Amun, favoured her. They saw in her not just intelligence, but piety and political savvy. They whispered that perhaps the gods themselves approved of her stewardship. High officials, who cared less about tradition and more about functioning government, supported her quietly. Egypt was stable, trade was flowing, and temples were being funded. Why rock the boat? But others watched with growing unease. A regent was supposed to fade away when the boy king came of age, not rise like the sun overtaking the sky. And yet Hatshepsut's presence grew larger, her influence heavier. She acted not like a placeholder, but like someone preparing Egypt for a new kind of leadership. By her 7th year as regent, the transformation was complete. Hatshepsut no longer stood beside the throne. She sat on it. She did the unthinkable. She declared herself pharaoh, not queen regent. Pharaoh in full title, full authority, and full divine legitimacy. Egypt now had a woman not just holding power, but claiming it outright. And she had no intention of giving it back. When Hatshepsut finally declared herself pharaoh, it wasn't a moment of impulsive ambition. It was a masterclass in political engineering, religious symbolism, and psychological strategy. No woman before her had dared to claim the full throne of Egypt, not as queen, not as regent, but as pharaoh, the living embodiment of Horus, the divine ruler. Hatshepsut knew this was unprecedented. She also knew it was necessary. Egypt couldn't afford uncertainty. Long-distance trade routes needed protection. Temples needed patrons. Bureaucracies needed leadership. And frankly, the boy king Thutmose III was still far too young to carry the weight of an empire that spanned deserts, deltas, and foreign borders. Hatshepsut didn't seize power from chaos. She seized it from a vacuum, but she also understood the danger. Even the idea of a female pharaoh threatened the entire ideological backbone of Egypt. Pharaohs weren't just rulers. They were the male earthly forms of gods. To break that tradition required more than boldness. It required myth-making. So she forged a new narrative. In temple inscriptions and carved reliefs, she declared that her father, Thutmose I, had personally chosen her as his successor. Priests circulated stories claiming that the god Amun himself had visited Hatshepsut's mother in disguise, foretelling her divine birth. These weren't lies. They were strategies Egypt ran on symbolism, and Hatshepsut used it like a weapon. Then came the transformation of her public image. She began appearing in the full regalia of a pharaoh, the Nemes headdress, the Shendit kilt, and most shockingly, the ceremonial beard. She wasn't pretending to be a man, she was embodying kingship in its symbolic form. In Egyptian thought, the role mattered more than the body that filled it. Still, she didn't erase her femininity entirely. In some statues, she appears as a woman in a tight-fitting gown. In others, she appears with masculine features and bare chest, like a traditional king. She crafted a fluid identity, part queen, part king, fully pharaoh. It was political brilliance disguised as religious obedience. The court watched. Some quietly supported her. Others whispered, waited, and sharpened their doubts like knives. But no one could deny the truth. Egypt ran better under Hatshepsut than it had in years. Becoming pharaoh wasn't rebellion. It was evolution. She wasn't stealing the throne. She was stepping into a role she believed destiny had prepared her for since childhood. And Egypt, surprisingly, seemed ready to follow. Once Hatshepsut claimed the throne, she faced her greatest challenge, convincing an entire civilization that a woman could embody a role traditionally reserved for men. Egypt wasn't just sexist by culture, it was sexist by theology. The pharaoh wasn't merely a political leader. He was Horus incarnate, the divine son of Osiris. The imagery, the rituals, the titles, everything was built on masculine symbolism. Hatshepsut didn't try to erase this structure. She outsmarted it. Her strategy hinged on one idea. Identity in Egypt was performance, and anyone who could perform kingship convincingly could be king, so she crafted a new visual language for herself. In statues, she appeared with the traditional kilt, broad chest, and the iconic false beard worn by male pharaohs. It wasn't a disguise, it was a costume, like a modern judge's robe or a monarch's crown. It signaled legitimacy, continuity, and sacred authority. Priests understood it. Officials understood it. Even commoners understood it. When the figure looked like a pharaoh, wore the crown of a pharaoh, and spoke with the authority of a pharaoh, then it was a pharaoh. Yet Hatshepsut didn't erase her womanhood. She allowed duality. In some reliefs, she appears fully feminine, wearing the clinging sheath dress of royal women. In others, her body is stylized into masculine ideals: broad shoulders, angular jaw, powerful posture. This was not confusion. It was strategy. She offered her audience options. Traditionalists could cling to the male-coded imagery. Progressives could accept her as a powerful woman. Everyone found something to support. Her greatest innovation was merging these two identities into a seamless narrative. Instead of choosing male ruler or female ruler, she became both at once, the daughter of a pharaoh and the chosen successor of the gods. The body didn't matter. The role did. And her choice of the beard, one of the most iconic symbols of Egyptian kingship, became her signature. It wasn't attached with glue, it was carved in stone. A message, a declaration, a redefinition of power. It said, "I am Pharaoh because I wear what pharaohs wear, do what pharaohs do, and command what pharaohs command." The court could whisper, the nobles could pretend to frown. But when her statues appeared in temples across Egypt, towering, serene, unmistakably royal, the message was clear. Hatshepsut had not broken tradition. She had absorbed it, remolded it, and made it entirely her own. She didn't hide behind masculinity. She weaponized it. If claiming the throne was Hatshepsut's boldest move, building was her loudest. She understood something fundamental about Egypt. Rulers lived or died not by gossip or court politics, but by stone. A pharaoh's monuments were their voice across millennia. The weak left nothing. The strong carved their names into the bones of the earth Hatshepsut intended to be remembered. Her architectural reign exploded with ambition. She ordered new constructions everywhere: temples, shrines, obelisks, chapels, statues. It was as if Egypt itself had woken from sleep and begun expanding. And at the centre of this building, frenzy stood her masterpiece, Djeser Djeseru, her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. Imagine an ancient wonder built into the cliffs of Thebes, terraces rising like steps to the heavens, columns lined in perfect symmetry, ramps leading up to sanctuaries glowing with incense and the colours of the gods. It wasn't just a temple. It was a declaration, a statement crafted in limestone. I am Pharaoh. I am timeless. Her architects, led by her loyal official Senenmut, designed the complex with mathematical precision and breathtaking elegance. Reliefs inside told stories of her divine birth, her coronation, and her deeds. A political campaign carved in stone rather than shouted in court. And unlike other rulers whose monuments screamed conquest, Hatshepsut's temple emphasized harmony, religion, and prosperity. It reflected her reign, calm, stable, and undeniably grand. But Djeser was only the crown jewel. Hatshepsut also revitalized the Temple of Karnak, one of Egypt's holiest sites. She erected towering obelisks. Massive spires of rose granite dragged hundreds of miles from Aswan. One of her obelisks still stands today, catching sunlight just as she intended over 3,000 years ago. These weren't mere monuments, they were political anchors. Every stone reminded Egyptians that her rule was sanctioned by the gods, prosperous in practice and rooted in tradition. Her building projects also employed thousands, stimulating the economy and spreading wealth among artisans, labourers and priests. Temples meant offerings. Offerings meant jobs. Jobs meant loyalty. Through construction, Hatshepsut didn't just build monuments, she built support. In a kingdom where kings proved their power through war, Hatshepsut proved hers through creation. Her legacy rose from quarries and desert sands, challenging centuries of masculine rule not by force, but by scale, beauty, and permanence. She reshaped Egypt's skyline. She reshaped Egypt's memory. And with every stone, she ensured that history could never easily erase her, even if her enemies would try. If Hatshepsut's monuments were her voice in stone, the Punt expedition was her voice carried across oceans. Every pharaoh before her had dreamed of reaching Punt, the land of the gods, a mysterious realm rich in incense, gold, ebony, exotic animals, and wonders whispered about in temple halls. But Hatshepsut did more than dream. She launched one of the greatest trade expeditions in ancient Egyptian history, an undertaking so bold it was carved across her temple walls as a triumph equal to any military conquest. Egypt was powerful, but it craved certain luxuries only Punt could offer, especially myrrh, the sacred incense used in rituals, medicine, and embalming. Myrrh wasn't just valuable, it was divine currency. Controlling its flow meant controlling religious legitimacy itself. Hatshepsut understood that trade could achieve what armies could not, and she was determined to secure wealth without spilling blood. Under her orders, a fleet of large, sleek ships was constructed at the Nile docks. These weren't simple fishing vessels. They were ocean-worthy craft capable of crossing the Red Sea, a logistical achievement that required skilled sailors, carpenters, navigators, and translators. Imagine a convoy of gilded ships slicing through the water, sails full, the horizon shimmering with heat and possibility. When her expedition reached Punt, the Egyptians were welcomed like honoured guests. Hatshepsut's reliefs show scenes of abundance, trees heavy with incense resin, piles of gold rings, exotic animals, and even the famously rotund Queen of Punt, who appears in the carvings with exaggerated features, one of the most recognisable figures in Egyptian art. The imagery is almost boastful, as if to declare, "Look what diplomacy achieved, no war, no blood, only prosperity." What returned to Egypt was astonishing. Shiploads of myrrh saplings to plant in Egypt's soil, a first in Egyptian history. Exotic goods that dazzled nobles and priests. Livestock and rare animals that enriched temple offerings. And most importantly, prestige. A ruler who could secure Punt's wealth was not merely competent, she was divinely favoured. Hatshepsut even had the scenes immortalised on the walls of Djeser, turning the entire event into a PR masterpiece carved for eternity. The message was unmistakable. While other pharaohs conquered neighbours, she connected worlds. The expedition wasn't just about trade, it was about legitimacy, about proving that her reign brought prosperity, stability, and divine blessing. Hatshepsut didn't need a battlefield to demonstrate greatness. She needed ships, and the courage to send them beyond the horizon. While Hatshepsut ruled Egypt with confidence and unmatched stability, one figure stood just slightly behind her, watching, learning, waiting. Thutmose III, the boy king who was pharaoh in name long before he had any real power, grew up under the long shadow of his stepmother's extraordinary reign. To the outside world, he appeared obedient and quiet, but inside the palace, inside his young mind, a transformation was brewing. When Hatshepsut first became regent, Thutmose III was too young to care. The throne meant little to a child more fascinated by chariots, hunting birds, and palace pets. But as he grew older, the political landscape began to reshape the way he saw himself. He wasn't just a prince. He was supposed to be pharaoh, the sole ruler, the divine embodiment of Horus. Yet every temple relief, every obelisk, every proclamation declared Hatshepsut as the ruling pharaoh. She wasn't preparing him for rule. She was ruling in his place. Still, Hatshepsut didn't mistreat him or undermine him publicly. She ensured he received a prince's education, military training, religious instruction, diplomatic etiquette. She made him commander of the armies at a young age, a gesture that looked generous on the surface but was also politically clever. A military title satisfied tradition, but it kept him busy, far from court politics. Meanwhile, her own loyal officials, especially Senenmut, filled the administrative vacuum around her. Thutmose found himself surrounded by adults who owed their careers to her. For a young heir, this wasn't reassuring. It was suffocating. Imagine being told from birth that you were destined to rule the mightiest kingdom on earth, only to watch someone else, someone outside the traditional line, wear the crown, give the orders, receive the praise, and carve her legacy into stone. Every year that passed strengthened her claim and weakened his. But Thutmose was patient. He studied Egypt's bureaucratic machinery. He learned the army inside out. He observed the priests, the nobles, the officials, and he remembered who supported her and who didn't. Hatshepsut's reign made Egypt wealthy, stable, and powerful, but it also left a trail of political resentments, quiet rivalries, and personal frustrations. And Thutmose III, growing from boy to young man, took note of every one of them. He didn't challenge her. He didn't rebel. He simply waited, because he knew that time, something even a pharaoh cannot control, was on his side, and when that time arrived, the consequences would reshape everything. When Hatshepsut died, peacefully it seems, around middle age, Egypt didn't erupt into chaos. There was no rebellion, no civil war, no dramatic struggle for the throne. The transition was seamless. Thutmose III, now a fully grown and battle-tested man, simply stepped into full power. But what came next was not a gentle succession. It was a calculated rewriting of history, executed with the precision of a military campaign. Years after her death, not immediately, but deliberately, Thutmose began erasing Hatshepsut from the record. This was not impulsive rage. This was methodical. Her statues were ripped from their pedestals and smashed. Her cartouches, the sacred name rings that guaranteed eternal life, were chiseled off walls, scraped away until nothing remained but faint outlines. Her images in reliefs were replaced with those of Thutmose's own family. In some places, workers carved crude blocks where her figure once stood, like scars left in stone. Her monumental temple at Deir el-Bahari escaped total destruction. Fortunately, it was too massive and too sacred to demolish, but many of her inscriptions were defaced, her titles struck out, her likenesses hammered away. It was as though the kingdom wanted to pretend she had never existed. But why? Historians debate this endlessly. Was it revenge? Jealousy? A political purge? Or something far more strategic? The most accepted explanation is this. Thutmose III needed to re-establish the traditional, male-only lineage of kingship. Having a successful female pharaoh in the royal line risked encouraging other powerful women, or rival claimants, to attempt the same. By erasing her, he restored the image of unbroken male rule Egypt, after all, depended heavily on stability, ritual, and continuity. A single deviation, even a successful one, threatened the narrative that pharaohs were divine, unchanging, eternally male. Another possibility is personal. Thutmose spent his youth overshadowed by Hatshepsut. Her achievements dwarfed his early years, her monuments outshining anything he had built at the time. Removing her legacy may have been a way to reclaim the throne that he felt had been denied to him, not by violence, but by brilliance. And yet, oddly enough, he didn't erase everything. He left some of her obelisks standing, sometimes simply building walls around them. He did not desecrate her burial. His actions were political, not spiteful. Ironically, the attempt to erase her only made her more fascinating to later historians. The scars, the gaps, the ghostly outlines on temple walls, these became clues Thutmose may have tried to silence her, but his chisels ended up whispering her name across time. And today, Hatshepsut is remembered not as a footnote, but as one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs. For centuries after her death, Hatshepsut existed as a ghost in Egyptian history, erased from king lists, overwritten in temple inscriptions, and buried beneath the political narrative that only men could rule as pharaoh tourists in ancient times walked past her monuments without knowing her name. Priests recited hymns in halls she built without acknowledging the queen who commissioned them. Her story lay hidden beneath layers of chiseled stone, forgotten intentionally and successfully for a time. But history has a way of protecting the extraordinary. In the 19th century, when European archaeologists began unearthing the ruins of ancient Egypt, they started noticing something strange. A pattern of missing names and defaced images clustered around the reign of Thutmose. The third, inscriptions looked oddly incomplete. Statues appeared vandalized in a consistent, systematic way, and in one temple, a massive set of monuments seemed to belong to a pharaoh, whose name had been erased repeatedly, but whose achievements were unmistakable. Something, or someone, had been hidden. Then came the discovery at Deir el-Bahari. As archaeologists cleared sand from the terraces of a grand mortuary temple, unlike anything else in Egypt, they began reading the surviving inscriptions. There, carved into the very architecture of the cliffs, was a story of divine birth, royal legitimacy, and triumphant rule. The name was missing in many places, but enough remained to identify her. Hatshepsut, the woman pharaoh. Piece by piece, researchers reconstructed her reign. Her trade expeditions to Punt, her building projects, her bold claim to kingship, her years of peace and prosperity. The more they uncovered, the clearer the truth became. Egypt under Hatshepsut was strong, stable, wealthy, and innovative. She was not a usurper. She was a visionary. Suddenly those chiseled-out cartouches and defaced statues didn't represent failure. They represented fear. Fear of her success. Fear of her precedent. Fear that her story, if left intact, would challenge the very foundations of pharaonic tradition. And in a poetic twist, that fear ensured her resurrection. The erasures created a mystery. The mystery drew attention, and attention dragged her back into the light. Today, Hatshepsut stands not as an anomaly, but as a testament to what leadership looks like when ambition meets intelligence, diplomacy meets strategy, and power meets purpose. She proved that kingship was not a gender, it was a role, a burden, and a vision. Her monuments still rise from the desert. Her obelisks still catch the sun. Her story, once silenced, now roars across history. Hatshepsut didn't just rule Egypt. She rewrote what a pharaoh could be. England in the mid-15th century wasn't a stable kingdom. It was a pressure cooker about to explode. On paper, the country had a king, a court, and a functioning government. In reality, everything depended on one fragile man, King Henry VI, a ruler so gentle, so passive, and so tragically unfit for power that the crown seemed heavier on him than on any monarch before Henry preferred prayer over politics, charity over strategy, and peace over strength. That might sound admirable, but in the medieval world, a king who couldn't project dominance might as well have handed his sword to the nearest ambitious noble, and England had ambitious nobles in abundance. The country was still licking its wounds from the 100 Years' War. Armies were returning home unemployed, angry and heavily armed. Taxes were rising, local conflicts were erupting, and most importantly, the throne itself looked shockingly vulnerable. Henry suffered terrifying bouts of mental collapse, periods when he could not speak, could not recognize his wife, and could not comprehend that he was king at all. During these episodes, England had no pilot at the helm. Power rushed into the vacuum. At the centre of this storm were two royal houses, both descended from King Edward III, and both convinced they were the rightful rulers of England. The House of Lancaster, marked by the red rose, held the throne through Henry VI. Their power rested on tradition, loyalty, and the fierce will of Henry's French-born queen, Margaret of Anjou, a woman far tougher and more politically calculating than her husband ever hoped to be. Opposing them stood the House of York, symbolised by the white rose and led by Richard, Duke of York. Richard wasn't just ambitious. He was competent. He had blood claim, battlefield experience, and a network of allies who believed England deserved a king who could actually rule. For years, tensions simmered, parliamentary disputes, whispered insults, alliances forming in candlelit chambers. But everything escalated when Henry fell into a near catatonic state, and Richard of York was appointed protector of the realm. Suddenly, England had something it hadn't seen in years: strong leadership. Many nobles liked it. Queen Margaret did not. She saw Richard not as a temporary caretaker, but as the man poised to steal her son's future. The political feud became personal, then poisonous, then uncontrollable. Loyalties began shifting like the tide. Families armed themselves, castles stocked provisions. Everyone sensed what was coming. England was no longer a kingdom, it was tinder, waiting for a spark. The spark finally ignited on a warm day in May 1455, in the quiet market town of St. Albans, a place that had seen more wool trading than warfare. No one expected history to explode in its narrow streets. But this was where England's simmering political feud turned into open war. Richard, Duke of York, marched towards St. Albans with a clear demand. He wanted to confront the Lancastrian lords who had blocked his rise and poisoned his reputation at court. He insisted he had no intention of harming King Henry VI. All he wanted, he claimed, was justice. The Lancastrian lords, especially the powerful and stubborn Duke of Somerset, dismissed these demands entirely. They believed York was positioning himself to take the crown. Negotiations collapsed within hours. Both armies were small by medieval standards, barely a few thousand men total, but their hatred was enormous. The Lancastrians barricaded themselves inside the town, confident that York wouldn't dare attack with the king present. They severely misjudged the moment. York's forces stormed the barricades. Fighting spilled through the streets, past market stalls and timber-framed homes. This wasn't the chivalric spectacle England loved to romanticize. It was personal, savage, and shockingly close quarters. Noblemen who had once dined together now hacked at one another in alleyways barely wide enough for two horses to pass. The turning point came when York's men found a weak spot in the defensive lines and pushed straight into the heart of the town. In the chaos, several key Lancastrian nobles were cornered and cut down, including the Duke of Somerset, York's most bitter rival. The symbolism was unmistakable. St. Albans wasn't just a victory, it was a statement. Meanwhile, King Henry himself was caught in the crossfire. Wounded by an arrow in the face, he was discovered cowering in a tanner's shop, trembling and confused. York's men approached him not with hostility, but with theatrical respect. They dressed his wound, bowed deeply, and escorted him to York's camp. It was a chilling display. York had protected the king, after defeating the king's army. When the dust settled, York stood as the most powerful man in England. He claimed he fought only to remove evil counsellors, not to seize the crown. But everyone saw the truth behind the polite phrasing. The first blood had been spilled, the first noble heads had fallen, and England understood, with icy clarity, that this was no mere feud. It was the beginning of a war that would swallow a generation. After St. Albans, England entered a twilight state. Neither peace nor full war, but a tense, brittle calm held together by fear and formality. Richard of York had won the battle and eliminated his rivals, yet he still insisted he acted only to protect King Henry VI. But England was not fooled. A king who could barely string sentences together was not running the country. York was. Henry's mental fragility became impossible to hide. Sometimes he wandered aimlessly. Sometimes he stared blankly, unable to respond. Sometimes he simply shut down. England effectively had a king in name only, and when a kingdom has a crown with no mind behind it, power moves sideways, into the hands of those bold enough to grasp it. But if Richard of York expected smooth sailing, he underestimated one person, Queen Margaret of Anjou. Margaret saw the truth clearly. York wasn't just protecting Henry, he was positioning himself to steal her son's inheritance. And Margaret was not a passive medieval wife. She was fierce, politically razor-sharp, and utterly unwilling to let her child become a footnote in York's story. While Henry drifted in and out of lucidity, Margaret became the Lancastrian war engine. She rallied northern nobles, forged alliances, promised lands and titles, and stirred loyalty with fiery speeches. Nobles who hesitated to follow a fragile king found new strength under a queen who refused to surrender. Meanwhile, York's power grew. He was appointed protector again, effectively acting king in everything but name. He controlled the government, commanded the military, and wielded more practical authority than the monarch himself. But the more control he seized, the more the lines blurred between protector and usurper. England split down the middle. In the north and west, the Red Rose of Lancaster gained momentum under Margaret's leadership. Hardened warriors, local clans, and loyal magnates rallied to her cause. In the south and east, the White Rose of York thrived. Wealthy merchants, ambitious nobles, and veteran commanders saw York as the future. Every noble household was forced to choose a side. Some chose out of loyalty. Others chose out of fear. Many chose out of convenience, and nearly all would change sides before the war was over. By the late 1450s, England was a tinderbox again. Margaret built armies. York prepared defences. Everywhere, men sharpened weapons, prayed, and waited. The uneasy calm after St. Albans wasn't peace. It was the long inhale before England screamed. By 1461, the War of the Roses had transformed from a noble feud into a national nightmare. Alliances had shifted, armies had grown, and England's countryside was scarred by marching boots and burned villages. The fragile balance between Lancaster and York shattered completely when Richard of York was killed at Wakefield, his head displayed on a spike, mockingly crowned with paper. But York's death didn't break his cause, it lit it on fire. His 17-year-old son, Edward, Earl of March, took up the White Rose with a force that shocked even seasoned commanders. Tall, charismatic, and fearless, Edward galvanised Yorkist support instantly. Within weeks, he marched toward London, seized the capital, and declared himself King Edward IV, even though the Lancastrians still held the reigning king, Henry VI, in their camp. The stage was set for the battle that would define the war. On March 29th, 1461, near the village of Towton, two colossal armies, up to 60,000 men combined, met on a frozen field during a ferocious blizzard. Snow blew horizontally. The wind howled, and yet both sides advanced, knowing the crown itself depended on the outcome. The opening volleys of arrows were brutal. The Yorkists, fighting with the wind at their backs, fired farther and harder. Lancaster's arrows, pushed back by icy gusts, fell short. Useless. As their ammunition dwindled, the Lancastrians charged, desperate to close the distance. What followed wasn't a battle. It was slaughter. The two forces collided in a massive melee that lasted for hours. Men slipped on blood-slick mud. Blades shattered on armour. Horses crashed into walls of infantry. Snow turned red. Towton became a grinding, merciless test of endurance, where even veterans felt fear in their bones. At one point, the Lancastrians pushed the Yorkists back, nearly breaking their line, until reinforcements arrived under the Duke of Norfolk, smashing into Lancaster's flank and turning the tide. Panic erupted. The Red Rose army began to crumble, and then came the rout. Lancastrian soldiers, exhausted and terrified, fled across the Cockbeck River, only to drown under the weight of their armour. Others were cut down on the frozen slopes, as Yorkist pursuit continued without mercy. When the sun set, bodies covered the field so densely that chroniclers claimed one could walk from one end to the other without touching the ground. Towton ended with a decisive Yorkist victory. Edward IV was king, not just in proclamation, but in blood. England had never seen a day so brutal, and it would never forget it. After Towton, Edward IV emerged not just as a victorious claimant, but as a king forged in fire. England, exhausted from years of instability, finally had a monarch who looked the part. Tall, imposing, charismatic, with the confidence of someone who had taken the crown with his own hands rather than inherited it. The Yorkist dream seemed complete, but dreams in medieval politics tended to rot quickly. Edward began his reign with strength. He rewarded loyal nobles, stabilised the treasury, and brought a sense of youthful energy to the court. For the first time in years, festivals returned, commerce revived, and London breathed a collective sigh of relief. Yet, beneath the surface, the kingdom was still a powder keg, and one man held the match. That man was Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, better known as Warwick the Kingmaker. Warwick had been instrumental in putting Edward on the throne. His wealth, influence, and military power were so vast that he was practically England's co-ruler. For a time, the two men worked in harmony. Warwick forged alliances abroad while Edward consolidated support at home. But cracks appeared quickly, and pride widened them. Warwick wanted Edward to be a compliant king, a figurehead guided by Neville's strategy. Edward, however, was no puppet. He was young, ambitious, and stubborn. He made decisions that infuriated Warwick, most notably secretly marrying Elizabeth Woodville, a Lancastrian widow with no foreign alliances and a large, hungry family. This single marriage detonated the political landscape. Warwick had been negotiating a royal match with France. Edward's impulsive wedding humiliated him. Worse, the rise of the Woodville family threatened Neville dominance at court. Warwick felt sidelined, disrespected, and betrayed by the very king he had helped create. So he did what any dangerous, disillusioned noble with an army might do. He switched sides. Warwick began clandestine talks with Margaret of Anjou, the fierce Lancastrian queen who had refused to die politically. A pact between Warwick and Margaret was unthinkable, yet perfectly logical. Both wanted Edward gone. Both wanted their influence back. And both were willing to plunge England into chaos again to achieve it. The kingdom, briefly stable, began to wobble once more. Rumours of rebellion grew. Loyalties shifted. Even Edward's own brother, George, Duke of Clarence, joined Warwick's conspiracy. Edward had won England at Towton, but keeping it would prove far harder. The war wasn't over. It was mutating. And the Kingmaker was about to make, and unmake, a king all over again. By the mid-1460s, England was once again a chessboard, and Warwick the Kingmaker was the player flipping the board. Once Edward IV's greatest ally, Warwick now saw himself pushed aside, overshadowed by the Woodville family, and ignored by the king he had created. Warwick wasn't a man built for irrelevance. He was a man built for crowns, chaos, and control. And so he chose war. Again, his first move was clever: undermine Edward's authority from within. Warwick spread rumours, manipulated noble grievances, and stoked resentment toward the Woodvilles. He painted the king as reckless, controlled by his wife's family, and unworthy of the crown won at Towton. Many nobles, jealous of the Woodvilles' sudden rise, listened. Then Warwick acted. In 1469, he and Edward's own brother, George, Duke of Clarence, launched open rebellion. Clarence, ambitious and perpetually insecure, thought Warwick could make him king instead. The alliance of convenience was poisonous, but effective. They captured Edward, seized control of the government, and executed several of the king's closest supporters. For a moment it looked as if the kingmaker had toppled his creation. But Warwick made one critical mistake. He couldn't govern without Edward nobles refused to recognise Clarence as a viable king. The country didn't rally behind Warwick's authority, and Edward, charming, confident, politically agile, still had the loyalty of London and key Yorkist supporters. Unable to maintain control, Warwick reluctantly released Edward. Edward regained power, but only briefly. Warwick and Clarence fled abroad to rethink their strategy. What they did next was unthinkable. They allied with Margaret of Anjou, the same Queen Warwick had spent years defeating, the same woman whose armies he had crushed. But desperation erases old hatred. Margaret wanted her husband restored. Warwick wanted revenge. Their alliance was sealed through marriage between Warwick's daughter, Anne Neville, and Margaret's son, Prince Edward. The Red Rose and the Kingmaker had joined forces, and it worked. Warwick invaded England in 1470 with French support. Edward, caught off guard and betrayed again by shifting loyalties, fled into exile with his brother Richard, seeking refuge in Burgundy. Henry VI, feeble, broken and confused, was pulled from the Tower and restored to the throne as a Lancastrian puppet. After nearly a decade of Yorkist rule, England had a new reality. The Kingmaker had undone his own masterpiece. But the war was far from over. Edward wasn't finished, and the throne was not done changing hands. Edward IV was not a man who tolerated exile. When he fled to Burgundy in 1470, he carried humiliation like a torch, and he had every intention of bringing it back to England to burn his enemies. But first, he needed allies. Burgundy, ruled by Charles the Bold, Edward's brother-in-law, had no love for Lancastrian France. Supporting Edward was a convenient way to strike back at the French crown and destabilise their new alliance with Warwick. With Burgundian gold and soldiers behind him, Edward returned to England in 1471, landing on the Yorkshire coast with a bold declaration. He wasn't invading, he was claiming his duchy. A clever lie. It allowed nobles who feared backing a traitor to join him without losing honour, and join him they did. As Edward marched south, men flocked to his banners. Old loyalties reawakened. Discontent with Warwick simmered. Even his treacherous brother George switched sides again, betraying Warwick just as easily as he had betrayed Edward. The Kingmaker's coalition began to fracture. Edward's ultimate goal was simple: reclaim the crown. To do that, he needed London. The city welcomed him with open arms. The people preferred a strong, charismatic king over a resurrected, mentally broken Henry VI. Edward marched straight to the Tower and reclaimed Henry as his prisoner once more. With the passive Lancastrian king secured, Edward turned toward the true threat, Warwick. The confrontation came at Barnet on Easter Sunday, in a fog so thick that armies could barely see their own banners. Confusion swallowed the battlefield. Units accidentally attacked their own allies. Orders vanished into mist. But in that chaos, Edward thrived. His aggressive charge smashed through the Lancastrian lines, and Warwick, the man who made and unmade kings, was struck down while trying to flee the field. The Kingmaker was dead. His era of manipulation ended with a sword in the back, and his body displayed unceremoniously for the public to quell rumours of survival. But Edward had no time to celebrate. Queen Margaret and her son, Prince Edward, had landed in England the very day Warwick fell. The Lancastrian cause was battered, but not broken. A final confrontation loomed, one that would decide the fate of both roses forever. Edward had toppled the kingmaker. Now he had to finish the war, and nothing, not fog, betrayal, or prophecy, would stand in his way. With Warwick dead, Edward IV had crushed the mastermind behind his downfall. But the war itself still breathed Margaret of Anjou, relentless and undeterred, had finally returned to England with her son, Prince Edward, the Lancastrian heir. She refused to surrender her dynasty. She refused to accept Yorkist rule. And she refused to let her husband's fragile mind be the end of her family's legacy. Her plan was simple and desperate. Reach Wales, gather reinforcements, and raise a Lancastrian army strong enough to strike back. But Edward was faster. Fueled by momentum and vengeance, he raced across England with an army determined to end the conflict once and for all. Every step he took closed the window of hope, for Lancaster Margaret's forces were exhausted long before they reached Welsh support. Forced to turn and fight at Tewkesbury in May 1471, she made her final stand. The battlefield stretched across rolling fields and hedgerows, beautiful terrain for a picnic, catastrophic for retreat. Edward arranged his army with discipline, placing seasoned Yorkist captains at every advantage point. This wasn't the tentative Edward of earlier years. This was a hardened, confident warrior king determined to finish the story his father never could. The Lancastrians struck first, hoping to break the Yorkist line with a fierce assault. For a moment, it nearly worked. But Edward counterattacked with brutal precision, sending his brother Richard of Gloucester, young, deadly, and ambitious, into the fray. The Yorkist advance shredded Lancastrian formations with frightening speed. Then disaster struck the Red Rose completely. A hidden lane behind the battlefield turned into a death trap. As Lancastrian troops tried to retreat, cavalry crashed into them, cutting them down in droves. Men fell in heaps, trampled or slaughtered as they fled. The Lancastrian line dissolved, their morale shattered. Prince Edward, the last hope of the House of Lancaster, was captured. Accounts differ on what happened next, but the result was the same. The 18-year-old heir was killed, his blood marking the death of Lancastrian succession. Margaret of Anjou was taken prisoner shortly after, her fury finally broken. With the prince dead and Henry VI locked in the Tower, Lancaster no longer had a future. Tewkesbury wasn't just a defeat, it was extinction. Days later, Henry VI died mysteriously, almost certainly murdered on Edward's orders. The Lancastrian line was finished. After 20 years of bloodshed, England had one king, one dynasty, and one direction, or so it seemed. After Tewkesbury, England seemed finally at peace. Edward IV stood unchallenged, young, victorious, and charismatic. The Lancastrian line had been shattered. King Henry VI was dead in the Tower. Prince Edward was gone. Margaret of Anjou was broken in captivity. The Red Rose had wilted, but the Wars of the Roses were never about a single branch of a family. They were about ambition, survival, and the dangerous vacuum a weak monarchy creates, and the seeds of the next conflict were already rooted in the very dynasty that had supposedly triumphed. Edward's reign stabilised England, until his sudden death in 1483 at only 40 years old. His heir, the 12-year-old Edward V, never even had time to warm the throne. The boy and his younger brother were taken into custody by their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the same Richard who had fought fiercely at Tewkesbury. What happened next remains one of history's darkest mysteries. The princes were lodged in the Tower of London for their safety, and then disappeared. Most believe they were murdered, almost certainly with Richard's approval, and with the boys gone, Richard declared himself King Richard III. But Richard's moment of power was short and haunted. The Yorkist faction fractured. Many nobles, horrified by the disappearance of the princes, abandoned Richard. The people whispered that the Tower was cursed. Across the Channel, exiled Lancastrians sensed opportunity, and among them was a young, cautious, politically useful claimant, Henry Tudor. Henry had only a thin blood claim to Lancaster through his mother, but he had something much more important. Backers, disaffected Yorkists, surviving Lancastrians, French supporters, and nobles disgusted by Richard's ruthlessness all rallied behind him. For the first time, England wasn't simply choosing between red or white, it was choosing someone new. In 1485, Henry landed in Wales and marched toward destiny. At Bosworth Field, Richard III met him in battle. Richard charged with legendary bravery, so fiercely that chroniclers later said he fought like a boar driven mad. But bravery couldn't save him. He was surrounded, unhorsed, and killed. A crown, literally, was found in the mud and placed on Henry's head. He became King Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. To heal the nation, Henry married Elizabeth of York, uniting the red and white roses into the Tudor rose, ending the war not with victory alone, but with symbolic reconciliation. After 30 years of bloodshed, betrayal, and shifting loyalties, England finally had peace. But only because every other claimant was dead.